Continuing Phocion from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, Arise by Arthur Hugh Clough. Aristogiton, a common accuser, was a terrible man of war within the assembly, always inflaming the people to battle, but when the muster roll came to be produced, he appeared limping on a crutch, with a bandage on his leg. Phocion decried him afar off, coming in and cried out to the clerk, "Put down Aristogiton, too, as lame and worthless." So that it is little wonderful how a man so severe and harsh, upon all occasions, should, notwithstanding, obtain the name of good. Yet, though difficult, is not, I suppose, impossible for man's tempers, any more than for wines, to be at the same time harsh and agreeable to the taste. Just as, on the other hand, many that are sweet at the first taste are found, on further use, extremely disagreeable and unwholesome. Hyperides, found on further use, extremely disagreeable and unwholesome. Hyperides, we are told, once said to the people, "Do not ask yourselves, men of Athens, whether or not I am bitter, but whether or not I am paid for being so," as though a covetous purpose were the only thing that should make a harsh temper insupportable, and as if men might not even more justly render themselves obnoxious to popular dislike and censure by using their power and influence in the indulgence of their own private passions of pride and jealousy, anger and animosity. Phocion never allowed himself, from any feeling of personal hostility, to do hurt to any fellow citizen, nor indeed reputed any man his enemy, except so far as he could not but contend sharply with such as opposed the measures he urged for the public good, in which argument he was indeed a rude, obstinate, and uncompromising adversary. For his general conversation it was easy, courteous, and obliging to all, so to that point he would befriend his very opponents in their distress, and expose the cause of those who had differed most from him when they needed his patronage. His friends reproaching him for pleading in behalf of a man of indifferent character, he told them the innocent had no need of an advocate. Aristogiton, the sycophant, whom we mentioned before, having, after sentence passed upon him, sent earnestly to Phocion to speak with him in the prison, his friends dissuaded him from going. "Nay, by your favor," said he, "where should I rather choose to pay Aristogiton a visit?" As for the allies of the Athenians and the islanders, whenever any admiral besides Phocion was sent, they treated him as an enemy suspect, barricaded the gates, blocked up their havens, and brought in from the country their cattle, slaves, wives, and children, and put them in garrison. But upon Phocion's arrival, they went out to welcome him in their private boats and barges, with streamers and garlands, and received him at landing with every demonstration of joy and pleasure. When King Philip was effecting his entry into Euboea, and was bringing over troops from Macedonia, and making himself master of the cities by means of the tyrants who ruled them, Plutarch of Eretria sent to request aid of the Athenians for the relief of the island which was in imminent danger, of falling wholly into the hands of the Macedonians. Phocion was sent thither with a handful of men in comparison in expectation that Euboeans themselves would flock in and join him, but when he came he found all things in confusion, the country all betrayed, the whole ground as it were undermined under his feet by the secret pensioners of King Philip, so that he was in the greatest risk imaginable. To secure himself as far as he could, he seized a small rising ground which was divided from the level plains about Temana by deep watercourse, and here he enclosed and fortified the choicest of his army. And as for the idle talkers and disorderly bad citizens who ran off from his camp and made their way back, he bade his officers not regard them, since here they would have been not only useless and ungovernable themselves, but an actual hindrance to the rest, and further, being conscious of themselves of the neglect of their duty, they would be less ready to misrepresent the action, or raise a cry against them at their return home. When the enemy drew nigh, he bade his men stand to their arms until he had finished the sacrifice, in which he spent a considerable time, either by some difficulty of the thing itself, or on the purpose to invite the enemy nearer. Orisons and some other stuff may be timed, but sacrifices, there's more to it than just cutting some animal's neck and butchering. Plutarch, interpreting this tardiness as a failure in his courage, fell on alone with the mercenaries, which the cavalry receiving could not be contained, but issuing also out of the camp, confusedly and in disorder, spurred up to the enemy. The first who came up were defeated. The rest were put to rout. Plutarch himself took to flight, and a body of the enemy advanced, in the hope of carrying the camp, supposing themselves to have secured the victory. But by this time, the sacrifice being over, the Athenians within the camp came forward, and falling upon them, put them to flight, and killed the greater number as they fled among the entrenchments, while Phocion ordered his infantry to keep on the watch and rally those who came in from the previous flight. Himself, with a body of his best men, engaged the enemy in a sharp and bloody fight, in which all of them behaved with signal courage and gallantry. Thales, the son of Cineas, and Glaucus of Palamedes, who fought near the general, gained the honors of the day. Caliphanes also did a good service in the battle, recovering the cavalry from its defeat, and, with his shouts and encouragement, bringing them up to succor the general, who was in danger. He confirmed the victory obtained by the infantry. Phocion now expelled Plutarch from Eretria, and possessed himself of the very important fort of Zaretra, situated where the island is pinched in, as it were, by the seas on each side, and its breadth most reduced to a narrow girth. He released all the Greeks whom he took, out of fear of the public speakers at Athens, thinking that they might very likely persuade the people in their anger into committing some act of cruelty. This affair thus dispatched and settled, Phocion set sail homewards, and the allies had soon as good reason to regret the loss of his just and humane dealing as the Athenians, that of his experience and courage. Molossus, the commander, who took his place, had no better success than to fall alive into the enemy's hands. Philip, full of great thoughts and designs, now advanced with all his forces into the Hellespont to seize Chersonesus and Perinthus, and, after them, Byzantium. The Athenians raised a force to relieve them, but the popular leaders made it their business to prefer Carus to be general, who, sailing thither, effected nothing worthy of the means placed in his hands. The cities were afraid and would not receive his ships into their harbors, so that he did nothing but wander about, raising money from their friends and despised by their enemies, when the people, chaffed by the orators, were extremely indignant and repented having ever sent any help to the Byzantines. Phocion rose and told them that they ought not to be angry with the allies for distrusting, but with their generals for being distrusted. They make you suspected, he said, even by those who cannot possibly subsist without your succor. The assembly, being moved with the speech of his, changed their minds on the sudden, and commanded him immediately to raise another force and go himself to assist their confederates in the Hellespont. An appointment because I was expecting A there, but which in effect contributed more than anything to the relief of Byzantium, for Phocion's name was already honorably known, and an old acquaintance of his, who had been his fellow student in the academy, Leon, a man of high renown for virtue among the Byzantines, having vouched for Phocion to the city, they opened their gates to receive him, not permitting him, though he desired it, to encamp without the walls, but entertained him and all the Athenians with perfect reliance, while they too, requite their confidence, behaved among their new hosts soberly and inoffensively, and exerted themselves on all occasions with the greatest zeal and resolution for their defense. Thus King Philip was driven out of the Hellespont, and was despised to boot, whom till now it had been thought impossible to match, or even oppose. Phocion also took some of his ships and recaptured some of the places he had garrisoned, making besides several inroads into the country, which he plundered and overran, until he received a wound from some of the enemy, who came to the defense, and thereupon sailed away home. The Megarians at this time privately praying aid of the Athenians, Phocion, fearing lest the Boeotians should hear of it, and anticipate them, called an assembly at sunrise, and brought forward the petition of the Megarians, and immediately after the vote had been put and carried in their favor, he sounded the trumpet, and led the Athenians straight from the assembly to arm and put themselves in posture. The Megarians received them joyfully, and he proceeded to fortify Nisaa, and built 2 new long walls from the city to the arsenal, and so joined it to the sea, so that having now little reason to regard the enemies on the land side, it placed its dependence entirely on the Athenians. When final hostilities with Philip were now certain, and in Phocion's absence other generals had been nominated, he, on his arrival from the islands, dealt earnestly with the Athenians, that since Philip showed peaceful inclinations towards them, and greatly apprehended the danger, they would consent to a treaty, being contradicted in this by one of the ordinary frequenters of the courts of justice, a common accuser, who asked him if he durst presume to persuade the Athenians to peace, now their arms were in their hands. Yes, said he, though I know that if there be war, I shall be in office over you, and if peace, you over me. But when he could not prevail, and Demosthenes' opinion carried it, advising them to make war as far off from home as possible, and fight the battle out of Attica. Good friends, said Phocion, let us not ask where we shall fight, but how we may conquer in the war. That will be the way to keep it at a distance. If we are beaten, it will be quickly at our doors. After the defeat, when the clamorers and incendiaries in the town would have brought up Charidemus to the hustings to be nominated to the command, the best of the citizens were in a panic, and supporting themselves with the aid of the council of Areopagus, with entreaties and tears, hardly prevailed upon the people to have Phocion entrusted with the care of the city. He was of opinion in general that the fair terms to be expected from Philip should be accepted. Yet after Demades had made a motion that the city should receive the common conditions of peace in concurrence with the rest of the states of Greece, he opposed it till it were known what the particulars were which Philip demanded. He was overborne in this advice under the pressure of the time, but almost immediately after the Athenians repented it, and when they understood that by these articles they were obliged to furnish Philip both with horse and shipping. It was the fear of this, said Phocion, that occasioned my opposition. But since the thing is done, let us make the best of it, and not be discouraged. Our forefathers were sometimes in command, and sometimes under it, and by doing their duty, whether as rulers or as subjects, saved their own country and the rest of Greece. Upon the news of Philip's death, he opposed himself to any public demonstrations of joy and jubilee, saying it would be ignoble to show malice upon such an occasion, and that the army that had fought them at Chaeronea was only diminished by a single man. When Demosthenes made his invectives against Alexander, now on his way to attack Thebes, he repeated those verses of Homer. Unwise one, wherefore to a second stroke his anger be full hearty to provoke, and asked, why stimulate his already eager passion for glory? Why take pains to expose the city to the terrible conflagration now so near? We who accepted office to save our fellow citizens will not, however they desire it, be consenting to their destruction. Yeah, no matter what your relationship with somebody, if they want what's not good, what's not right for them, you just don't take part. And of course, politically, it's not, oh, I'll lose the election if I do what's good for the people. Lose the election, lose your corporate sponsors. Do the best job you can in office while you're there. And then, eventually be learned that, oh, we're going to get decent people elected. And they're going to do a decent job in office. sometimes have like a scratch sound against all these things. After Thebes was lost, and Alexander had demanded Demosthenes, Lycurgus, Hyperides, and Charidemus to be delivered up, the whole assembly turning their eyes to him, and calling on him by name to deliver his opinion. At last he rose up, and showing them one of his most intimate friends, whom he loved and confided in above all others, told them, "You have brought things amongst you to that pass, that for my part should have brought should he demand this, my friend Nicholas would not refuse to give him up, for as for myself, to have it in my power to sacrifice my own life and fortune to the common safety, I should think the greatest of good fortune. Truly," he added, "it pierces my heart to see those who are fled hither for succor from the desolation of Thebes, yet it is enough for Greece to have Thebes to deplore. It would be more for the interest of all that we should depreciate the conqueror's anger, and intercede for both, than run the hazard of another battle." When this was decreed by the people, Alexander is said to have rejected their first address when it was presented, throwing it from him scornfully, and turning his back upon the deputation, who left him in affright. But the second, which was presented by Phocion, he received understanding from the older Macedonians how much Philip had admired and esteemed him, and he not only gave him audience and listened to his memorial and petition, but also permitted him to advise him, which he did to this effect, that if his designs were for quietness, he should make peace at once. If glory were his aim, he should make war, not upon Greece, but on the barbarians, with various counsels and suggestions, happily designed to meet the genius and feelings of Alexander. He so won upon him and softened his temper, that he bade the Athenians not to forget their position, as if anything went wrong with him, the supremacy belonged to them, and to Phocion himself, whom he adopted as his friend and guest, he showed a respect. He admitted him to distinctions which few of those who were continually near his person ever received. Dries, at any rate, tells us that when he became great and had conquered Darius, in the heading of all his letters he fell off the word greeting, except in those he wrote to Phocion, to him, and to Antipater alone. He condescended to use it. This also is stated by Carus. As for his munificence to him, it is well known he sent him a present at one time of 100 talents. And this being brought to Athens, Phocion asked of the bearers how it came to pass that among all the Athenians he alone should be the object of this bounty. Being told that Alexander esteemed him alone a person of honor and worth, "Let him then," said he, "permit me to continue so and be so reputed." Following him to his house and observing his simple and plain way of living, his wife employed in kneading bread with her own hands, himself drawing water to wash his feet, they pressed him to accept it with some indignation, being ashamed, as they said, that Alexander's friend should live so poorly and pitifully. So Phocion pointed out to them a poor old fellow in a dirty worn-out coat, passing by, and asked them if they thought him in worse condition than this man. They bade him not mention such a comparison. Yet, said Phocion, he, with less to live upon than I, finds it sufficient. And in brief, he continued, if I do not use this money, what good is there in my having it? and if I do not use it, I shall procure an ill name, both for myself and for Alexander, among my countrymen. So the treasure went back again from Athens to prove to Greece by a signal example, that he who could afford to give so magnificent a present was yet not so rich as he who could afford to refuse it. And when Alexander was displeased and wrote back to him to say that he could not esteem those his friends who would not be obliged by him, not even would this induce Phocion to accept the money, but he begged leave to intercede with him in behalf of Cratides, the sophist, and Athenodorus, the Imbrian, and also for Demaratus and Spartan, 2 Rhodians, who had been arrested upon some charges and were in custody in Sardis. This was instantly granted by Alexander, and they were set at liberty. Afterwards, when sending Craterus into Macedonia, he commanded him to make him an offer of 4 cities in Asia: Chios, Gergithus, Melassa, and Elaea, any one of which, at his choice, should be delivered to him, insisting yet more positively with him, and declaring he should resent it should he continue to obstinate in his refusal. But Phocion was not to be prevailed with at all, and shortly after Alexander died, Phocion's house was shown to this day in Miletia, ornamented with small plates of copper, but otherwise plain and homely. Concerning his wives, of the first of them there is little said, except that she was sister of Cephisodatus, the statuary. The other was a matron of no less reputation for her virtues and simple living among the Athenians than Phocion was for his probity. It happened once when the people were entertained with a new tragedy, that the actor, just as he was to enter the stage to perform the part of a queen, demanded to have a number of attendants sumptuously dressed to follow in his train, and on their not being provided, was sullen and refused to act, keeping the audience waiting till at last Melanthus, who had to furnish the chorus, pushed him onto the stage, crying out, "What, don't you know that Phocion's wife is never attended by more than a single waiting woman? But you must needs be grand and fill our women's heads with vanity." This speech, shouldn't it be our women's heads with vanity? This speech of his, spoken loud enough to be heard, and received with great applause, and clapped all around the theatre. She herself, when once entertaining a visitor out of Ionia, who showed her all the rich ornaments made of gold and set with jewels, her wreaths, necklaces, and the like. "For my part," said she, "all my ornament is my husband, Phocion, now for the 20th year in office as general of Athens. He had a son named Phocus, who wished to take part in the games at the great feast of Minerva. He permitted him to do so in the contest of leaping, not with any view to the victory, but in the hope that the training and discipline for it would make him a better man, the youth being in a general way a lover of drinking and ill-regulated in his habits. On his having succeeded in the sports, many were eager for the honor of his company at banquets in celebration of the victory. Phocion declined all these invitations but one, and when he came to this entertainment and saw the costly preparations, even the water brought to wash the guests' feet being mingled with wine and spices, he reprimanded his son, asking him why he would so far permit his friend to sully the honor of his victory, and in the hope of wholly weaning the young man from such habits and company, he sent him to Lacedaemon, and placed him among the youths, then under the course of the Spartan discipline. This the Athenians took offense at, as though he had slighted and contemned the education at home, and Demades twitted him with it publicly. Suppose, Phocion, you and I advise the Athenians to adopt the Spartan constitution. If you like, I am ready to introduce a bill to that effect, and to speak in its favor. Indeed, said Phocion, you, with that strong scent of perfumes about you, and with that mantle on your shoulders, are just the very man to speak in honor of Lycurgus and recommend the Spartan table. Nowadays, of course, there's more issues with the perfumes because the perfumes tend to be, chemicals or harsh extracts when you can actually handle a rose or whatever. It's like rose perfume. I'm allergic to most of what these things are, but rose, I can have any type of rose stuffed in my pocket and all that stuff. Don't mind rose oil, can touch my skin, no problem. But of course, that stuff can be very expensive. I don't, go out of my way to get that sort of thing. But there's also those, not only the harsh chemicals that might be part of it, but you can have, artificial hormones. And it's like, you really want the young women trained to be attracted to horses? It's like, oh, you smell like a horse. Yeah, you're awesome. It's like, but they don't say it like that, right? Well, sometimes it's a bull. It depends. When Alexander wrote to demand a supply of galleys, and the public speakers objected to sending them, Phocion, on the council requesting his opinion, told them freely, Sirs, I would either have you victorious yourselves, are friends of those who are so. He took up Pythias, who about this time first began to address the assembly, and already showed himself a competent talking fellow by saying that a young slave whom the people had but bought yesterday ought to have the manners to hold his tongue, and when Harpalas, who had fled from Alexander out of Asia, carrying off a large sum of money, came to Attica, and there was a perfect race among the ordinary public men of the assembly who should be the first to take his pay. He distributed amongst these some trifling sums by the way of a bait and provocative, but to Phocion he made an offer of no less than 700 talents, and all manner of other advantages he pleased to demand, with the compliment that he would entirely commit himself and all his affairs to be disposed. Phocion answered sharply, Harpalus should repent of it if he did not quickly leave off corrupting and debauching the city, which for the time silenced him and checked his proceedings. But afterwards, when the Athenians were deliberating in council about him, and found those that had received money from him to be his greatest enemies, urging and aggravating matters against him to prevent themselves from being discovered, whereas Phocion, who had never touched his pay, now, so far as the public interest would admit of it, showed some regard to his particular security. Well, I suppose fugitives bribing people for their safety is common thing, but there's also the thing, it's acting not so much in regard of how far the government is away,